Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the June 2025 Consumer Price Index and Inflation release. It will be done by the government statistician, Dr. Alasa Idrisu. You are welcome again.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Deputy Government Statistician, directors from Ghana Statistical Service, our distinguished media personnel, you are welcome once again to our CPI release. Today, we release the June 2025 Consumer Price and Inflation for you and the general public. As we know by now, these numbers are more than just statistical entries. They represent the shifting realities of prices in our markets, shops, and homes across the country. They reflect how households are coping, how businesses are adjusting, and the contributions of price movements to macroeconomic stability and how policymakers should respond. Ladies and gentlemen, the release today would provide us with data that will enable us to attempt answers to a number of questions, including the question as to what is driving the price movement that we'll see today, what are the trends in prices and whether those trends are sustainable, how different are regions and households experiencing the price movement, and what are the implications of these price movements for households, for businesses, and then also for the government. Ladies and gentlemen, to present the CPI release for June, we would go through the following outline. We would look at the definitions and measurements, followed by providing you with the key highlights of inflation for the period. And then we'll look at the major price drivers. We'll conclude bringing out the key highlights for the June 2025 inflation. We'll also provide some recommendations, and then we'll point you to where you can find our publications on the subject matter. But as usual, before we delve into the June 2025 CPI data, it will be important for us to refresh our memory on some of the key terms that we'll be using today. Consumer Price Index, which we usually refer to as CPI, measures the changes in the price of a fixed basket of goods and services purchased by households. And then we have Consumer Price Inflation, which is the rate at which the prices of goods and services bought by the households are rising or falling. And usually we measure it as a percentage change in the CPI between two periods. Now, when we are measuring CPI or consumer price inflation, we do that based on data we collect on 307 items in the various markets in the country. And these items are in the basket. Now, 2021 is a base year that we use. The prices are captured from 57 markets, over 8,000 outlets, and on 47,800 products. These products are ordered into 13 divisions, 44 groups, 98 classes, 156 subclasses, and 307 items. Ladies and gentlemen, inflation is reported as either end of period or average. Usually, with regards to end of period, we're able to tell you inflation on year-on-year basis, quarter-on-quarter basis, or month-on-month basis. And then on average, we are usually looking at the average over the year. With this background on the definitions, let's quickly also refresh ourselves with regards to some of the recent innovations we've introduced to our CPI release. First, core inflation versus headline. From April and then May release, we try to introduce the concept of core inflation in comparison to headline inflation to enable us assess underlying persistent trends in inflation, which is very critical for economic policy making. And then we are also able to make a distinction between the inflation for goods compared to inflation for services. And we're able to do this just to ensure that we have a better understanding of the drivers of inflation. Again, we introduce the concept of annual average inflation, and we provide that in our annexes. And then we also introduce a very important term called the contributions, which enables us to assess the drivers of inflation. We've introduced infographics on every CPI release. So after this release, when you go to our website, not only would you see the annexes and then the slides, but you'd also have access to the infographics. And then as usual, we have a section on recommendations. Now, what are the highlights of the June 2025 inflation? Ladies and gentlemen, the CPI for June 2025 was 257.3, down from 260.5 in May 2025, and up from 226.4 in June 2024. Year-on-year rate of inflation for June 2025 was therefore 13.7%, a 4.7 percentage point drop from the May 2025 inflation of 18.4%. This means that on the average, the prices of goods and services increased by 13.7% between June 2024 and June 2025. On month-on-month basis, there was a deflation of 1.2% for June 2025, implying that the general price level fell by 1.2% between May and June 2025. This means that Ghanaians paid less for goods and services in June than they did in May 2025. The June inflation we have just reported is a sixth consecutive year-on-year drop we've seen in inflation, and is the lowest inflation in terms of year-on-year since December 2021. The downward inflationary trend over the last 6 months provides some consistency in terms of assurances with regards to a real sustained shift in prices. Ladies and gentlemen, the disinflation process we are observing means some breathing room for households, a more predictable environment for businesses, and for our policymakers, a powerful signal that recent fiscal and monetary efforts may be taking hold and the need to stay the course. Now, if you look at the trends of inflation over the period, we see that the graph on the upper panel shows that year-on-year inflation has been falling since December 2024, and at a much faster rate from April 2025. The lower panel graph also shows that month-on-month inflation steadily dropped from 2.6% in November 2024 to 0.2% in March 2025. It then rose to 0.8% in April 2025 and has since decreased, reaching a deflation of 1.2% in June 2025. And usually when we say deflation, we mean that the general price level is actually falling. Now, let's provide some more color with regards to the June 2025 inflation. And here, I would want to begin the discussion by bringing to your attention the figures we are seeing on core inflation. core inflation, which strips out volatile price movements, and in this particular case, we are looking at utilities, energy, and transportation, that is stripped out of the basket, fell by 11.2 percentage points to 8.3% in June 2025, down from 19.5% in May 2025. This suggests that the underlying pressures driving inflation are cooling and the foundations of our price system are stabilizing. The general price level of the said core items actually reduced by 6.5% between May and June 2025. Let's look at what is happening with regards to food and non-food inflation. Food inflation dropped by 6.5 percentage points to 16.3%, down from 22.8% in May 2025. Food inflation contributed 7 percentage points to the year-on-year inflation rate of 13.7% for June 2025. Now, given how heavily food prices weigh on the average Ghanaian in terms of households' budgets, this single trend can have a meaningful impact on people's lived experiences. The general price level of food items reduced by 0.5% between May and June 2025. So in other words, not only are we seeing year-on-year decline in food prices, but also between May and June, food prices actually reduced on the average, and it reduced by 0.5%. And then non-food inflation. We saw a decline in non-food inflation by 3 percentage points to 11.4% in June 2025, showing that the declines we are seeing is not just about one sector. It's not just about the food, but also non-food. Non-food inflation contributed 6.5 percentage points to the year-on-year inflation of 13.7% for June. The general price level of non-food items reduced by 1.8% between May and June. Goods inflation, which is inflation on goods such as food, gas, clothing, footwear, furnishings, housing, water, electricity, dropped by 4.9 percentage points to 15.2% and contributed 11 percentage points to the year-on-year inflation of 13.7% in June 2025. Given that goods make up the bulk of what households buy regularly, that's about 73% of Ghana's CPI basket, the drop in goods inflation is a significant benefit of every consumer. And again, if you look at the general price level of goods items between May and June 2025, we saw a reduction by 1.2%. Services inflation, which often includes rent, education, healthcare, insurance, financial services, and transport, and account for about 27.5% of Ghana's CPI basket, also dropped by 5 percentage points to 9.3% and contributed 2.5 percentage points to the year-on-year inflation of 13.7%. The general price level for services reduced by 3.3% between May and June 2025. This shows easing and provides a good sign for longer-term stability. Now, inflation on imports versus locally produced items also follows similar trends. Inflation for local goods and services, which was 14%, is still higher than that of imported goods and services, which was 12.5%, though we see that both of them are declining. Inflation pressures are declining more rapidly in local production than in imports, as inflation for locally produced items dropped by 5.2 percentage points, whilst that for imported items declined by 3.9 percentage points. Inflation for local items contributed the most, about 70%, to the June inflation of 13.7%. On month-on-month basis, the general price level for local items fell by 1.1%, whilst that for imported items fell by 1.8%. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, but not the least, let's look at what we saw with regards to regional inflation. While the national year-on-year inflation has cooled to 13.7%, some regions are still wrestling with much steeper price pressure, especially in the north, whilst others are recording inflation below the national average. The Upper West region continues to register the highest inflation at a striking 32.3%, though lower than the May inflation of 38.1%, but more than double the national average. In contrast, Bono East region recorded the lowest inflation of 8.4%. This regional disparity suggests a need for more granular policy responses. A one-size-fits-all approach simply would not work in this circumstance. Let's look at the trends in year-on-year food and non-food inflation over the one-year horizon. We see that year-on-year food prices have witnessed continuous decline from February 2025, when it was 28.1%, to June 2025, when it fell to 16.3%. On a month-on-month basis, the inflation rate for food declined consistently from 3.8% in November 2024 to a deflation of 0.2% in March 2025. However, April 2025 saw a reversal of this trend, with an uptick to 0.9%, which was maintained in May 2025 before reversing to a deflation of 0.5% in May 2025. With regards to non-food, year-on-year inflation has been on a downward trajectory since November 2024, when a recorded inflation rate of 20.7% to 11.7% in June 2025. On month-on-month basis, non-food inflation, however, saw consistent decline since January 2025, with inflation reducing from 1.4% in January 2025 to 0.6% in May 2025. It further reduced significantly to a deflation of 1.8% in June 2025. Now the question is, what is really driving the June's inflation? So we would attempt to answer this question by providing data on inflation with regards to the 13 divisions or classifications that we have. The data shows that apart from housing and utilities, and also information and communications divisions, all the other divisions witnessed lower inflation rates compared to May, with the largest drop observed in transport division. These two categories are mentioned, which is housing and utilities as well as information and communications, may warrant close monitoring for potential cost push pressures moving forward. The divisions that saw the sharpest decline in inflation are transport, which registered a decline of 11.5 percentage points, food and non-alcoholic beverages, which registered a decline of 6.5 percentage points, alcoholic beverages, tobacco and narcotics, which registered a decline of 6.3 percentage points, and personal care, social protection and miscellaneous goods, which registered a decline of 5.8 percentage points. The transport sector, as I mentioned earlier, recorded a deflation, meaning that it recorded actually a price reduction or price decline of 8.5%, representing a drop of 11.5 percentage points from the 3.1% in May 2025. This implies that average transportation prices dropped by 8.5% compared to their levels in June 2024. This actually helped drag inflation down by 0.9 percentage points in June 2025. Despite a 6.5 percentage fall in food and non-alcoholic beverages, the division remained the dominant driver of overall inflation, with inflation of 16.3% in June 2025, down from 22.8% in May 2025. It contributed the most, that's about 51%, to the June 2025 headline inflation of 13.7%. 5 out of the 13 divisions we have, namely food and non-alcoholic beverages, housing, water, electricity, gas and other fuels, clothing and footwear, recreation, sport and culture, and alcoholic beverages, tobacco and narcotics contributed about 89.1% of total inflation of 13.7% in June 2025. So that's the contribution that is shown on the chart, which shows that food and alcohol and non-alcoholic beverages actually contributed the most to inflation at 7.0 percentage points. And that's followed by housing, water, electricity, and gas and other fuels, 2.5%. And then you have clothing and footwear, 1.4 percentage points. Then recreation, sports, and culture, 0.7 percentage points. So these are the 13 divisions and their impact in terms of price movements on inflation. But the question also goes as to which are the 20 top items that contributed the most to inflation. Among the 20 top items contributing the most to inflation, we have electricity, recording the highest annual increase in price of about 139.3%, followed by refuse disposal of about 130.9%, payment for rent 86%, ginger 65%, charcoal 55.6%, traditional beer, or what we refer to as pito, 43.3%. Though electricity recorded the highest inflation in June 2025 at 139.3%, its contribution to the headline inflation of 13.7% in June is 1.2 percentage points, making it the second highest contributor after rent payment, which contributed 2.3 percentage points to inflation. Other top contributors to June 2025 inflation include refuse disposal, which contributed 0.7 percentage point to inflation. And then we have charcoal, 0.65 percentage points to inflation. Yam, 0.4 percentage points. Resold tap water in buckets, barrels, jerry cans, 0.3 percentage points. River fish, 0.3 percentage points. Cooked rice, 0.3 percentage points. University fees, 0.4 percentage points. And cinema and cultural services, 0.3 percentage points. Among the top 20 contributors to inflation, the items that saw price reductions between May and June include ginger, which actually saw a price reduction of 11.8%, yam, price reduction of 9.4%, smoked herrings, price reduction of 7.3%, akpeteshie, price reduction of 6.7%, beef, price reduction of 6.2%, fufu and soup, 5.2% price reduction, cooked rice, 3.9% price reduction, fried plantain and beans, 2% price reduction, river fish, 1.4% price reduction, and hostel dormitory accommodation, 1.2% price reduction. So this means that Even though these items are contributing the most to inflation, at the same time, they experience significant price reduction between May and June of 2025. The picture we have is telling the same story with regards to the top 20 contributors to inflation. Now let's look at disaggregation of food inflation by subclasses in terms of both month-on-month and then year-on-year inflation. Focusing on food subclasses, we witness a general downward trend for the 5 categories of food. And here we are looking at vegetables, tubers, plantains, cooking bananas, and pulses. That's one. And then we are looking at ready-made food and other food products. We are looking at cereals and cereal products, fish and other seafood, and then the fed live animals, meat, and other parts of slaughtered land animals. Inflation for key food categories showed downward trend in June 2025, with vegetables and meat prices declining sharply, while ready-made food and other food products experienced steady decline, as shown. Year-on-year inflation for vegetables, for tubers, plantain, cooking bananas, and pulses fell significantly from 44% in February 2025 to 24% in May 2025, and further down to 13% in June 2025, marking the largest drop over the period. Inflation for live animals, meat, and slaughtered parts continued to drop as well, after attaining a high rate of 30% in April 2025, from 21.9% in June 2025. Year-on-year inflation dipped further to 24.7% in June 2025, from 29.5% in May 2025. The downward trend since March signals improved domestic supply or easing demand. Inflation for ready-made food and other items continued to decline to 11.1% from 2.3% a year earlier, suggesting stable price in processed and prepared food products. For cereals and cereal products, inflation having risen steadily to 26.6% in May 2025, up from 11% in May 2024, dropped sharply to 17.1% in June 2025. This could likely be due to easing of pressures coming from import costs, logistics, or regional shortages. Inflation for fish and seafood has also seen a reversal of its increase to 24% in May 2025 to a rate of 16.2% in June 2025, likely influenced by reduced fuel and transport costs or supply chain volatility. Ladies and gentlemen, on month-on-month basis, we have all the major categories recording subdued changes, reflecting cooling price pressures. 3 out of the 5 groups experienced a deflation, again a price decline, in June 2025. And these were vegetable, tubers, plantain, pulses, and then 2 live animals, meat and slaughtered parts, and 3 cereals and cereal products. The most volatile items we knew in the past, like vegetables, have stabilized substantially since 2024. Now, let's provide some more color with regards to the regional inflation picture painted earlier. Like I said earlier, in June 2025, we saw widespread decline in year-on-year inflation across all 16 regions. Despite the widespread declines, the largest declines were observed in Savannah, which saw a decline of 10.4 percentage points. And then Bono also saw a very big decline, 8.6 percentage points. Then we have Bono East, 8.1 percentage points, Upper East, 7.7 percentage points, and then Eastern, 6.1 percentage points. These significant drops reflect broad-based easing of inflationary pressures across the regions. Ladies and gentlemen, Unfortunately, the Upper West region continued to record the highest inflation over the period. For some time now, is a region that is recording the highest, with overall inflation for the region being 32.3% in June. But I must say that this 32.3% is actually a decline if you compare it to the May inflation of 38.1%. It's a decline by 5.9 percentage points. But 32.3% is still very high if you compare it to the national average of 13.7%. There were other regions that recorded inflation above the national average, most of which were in the northern part of the country. And this included Upper East, where inflation was 18.9%, Savannah 18%, Northeast 17%, Northeast 17.3%, Western North 16%, Northern 15.9%, Ashanti 15.2%, Western 15.9%, and Oti 15%. The Bono East had the lowest inflation rate of 8.4% in June 2025. Despite the high inflation in the North, their contributions remain minimal due to low weights for the regions. The top 5 contributors to the June 2025 inflation in terms of the regions are: number 1, Greater Accra, which has the highest weight of 28.5, recording inflation of 12.2% and contributing the most to inflation of 3.5 percentage points. Next is the Ashanti region with a weight of 21.4%, registering inflation of 15.2% and contributing 3.3 percentage points to the inflation in June. And then we have Eastern region, which is the third highest, which has a weight of 10.3%, inflation of 12.2%, and it contributed 1.3 percentage points to inflation. Then the fourth is Western, which contributed 1.2 percentage points to inflation. It has a weight of 7.3%, and the inflation for the month of June for Western was 15.9%. And finally, we have Central region that contributed 1 percentage point to inflation. It has a weight of 8.8% and a recorded inflation rate of 11.1% for the period. Ladies and gentlemen, apart from Western and Bono Ahafo that witnessed increases in their monthly inflation between May and June 2025, all other regions experienced price reductions or no price change, showing broad-based softening of inflationary momentum, especially in the northern and middle belt. Bono saw the sharpest decline from 1.3% to a deflation of 3.8%, which is 5.1 percentage points drop. And then Savannah and Upper East both dropped by 3.3 percentage points. Now, how does the inflation look like with regards to the regions decomposed into food and non-food? Inflation pressures in Ghana remain regional, as we can see on the screen. And we see that the 5 northern regions, especially Upper West, Savannah, Northeast, Northern, and Upper East, are seeing extreme food inflation, with Upper West topping the chart at 40.1%. Food inflation was lowest in Bono East, 8.1%, followed by Ahafo, 8.2%, and Central, 11.1%. With regards non-food inflation, it was again highest in Upper West at 26%, with Eastern recording the lowest at 6.7%. Upper West remains the most inflationary region overall, leading in both food and non-food components. So, Let's try and break down what is really happening in the Upper West region. The Upper West region, as I said, leads as Ghana's most inflation-stricken region for June at 32.3%, largely driven by food inflation and utilities. While food inflation remains high at 40.1%, its inflation in the utilities, that's 125.4%, and education sector, 42.7%, that are sounding the alarm bell. Water, 34.4%, fruit and vegetables, vegetable juices, 34.2%, cereals and cereal products, 24.9%, coffee and coffee substitutes, 23.7%, and milk, other dairy products, and eggs, 17.5%, have high inflation, deepening the cost living pressures in the region. So, ladies and gentlemen, as a recap of the June inflation, the 13.7% year-on-year inflation represents a drop of inflation by 4.7 percentage points from the 18.4% recorded in May of this year. And this inflation of 13.7% is influenced by inflation on locally produced items, which reduced to 14% from 19.2% in May, as well as inflation on imported items, which reduced to 12.5% from 16.4% in May. In addition, the 13.7% inflation was also influenced by food inflation, which reduced to 16.3% from the 22.8% in May 2025, as well as non-food inflation, which reduced to 11.4% from the 14.4% registered in May. And as I mentioned earlier, the Upper West region recorded the highest inflation of 32.3%, which is significantly higher than the national average of 13.7%. And the Bono East region recorded the lowest inflation of 8.4%. On month-on-month basis, the price decline of 1.2% in May 2025, in June 2025 was a significant improvement from the May price increase of 0.7%. And this price decline in June 2025 actually is influenced by price decline in inflation on imported items by 1.8%, down from 0.6% in May 2025, and price decline on inflation on locally produced items to 1.1%, down from 0.8% in May 2025. In conclusion, we would say that year-on-year headline inflation declined by 4.7 percentage points to 13.7% in June 2025, down from 18.4% in May 2025, marking the lowest rate since December 2021 and the sixth straight decline in inflation. On a month-to-month basis, the general price level declined by 1.2% between May and June 2025. The trends we are seeing in both year-on-year and month-to-month inflation is a clear signal of sustained price stability and short-term price easing. Core inflation, which is inflation that strips off energy, utilities, transportation items, is significantly to 8.3%, down from 19.5% in May, indicating that underlying pressures driving inflation are cooling. Year-on-year food inflation declined by 6.5 percentage points to 16.3% in June, whilst non-food inflation dropped by 3 percentage points to 11.4%. Again, the general price level of food items reduced by 0.5% between May and June, whilst that for non-food items reduced by 1.8% over the same period. Year-on-year goods inflation also dropped significantly by 4.9 percentage points to 15.2% in June. And again, in terms of month-on-month, we saw general price decline with regards to goods by 1.2%. Similarly, on services, inflation dropped by 5 percentage points to 9.3% in June, with general price level declining again by 3.3% between May and June for services. With regards to locally produced goods and services, whose inflation stood at 14% at the end of June 2024, what we've seen is that even though it represents a decline, it is still higher than that of imported ones, which stood at 12.5% at the end of June. So we've seen both declining, but the local items decline is much higher than the declines we are seeing in imported items. The general price level for local items fell by 1.1% between May and June, whilst that for imported items fell by 1.8%. And again, we want to emphasize that the Upper West region continued to register the highest inflation at a striking 32.3%, though lower than the May inflation of 38.1%. But like I mentioned earlier, more than double the national average of 13.7%. Bono East recorded the lowest inflation at 8.2%. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to emphasize in the conclusion that the top 5 contributors to inflation by division, which contributed 89% to the 13.7% inflation in June, are food and non-alcoholic beverages, 7 percentage points. Housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels, 2.5 percentage points. Clothing and footwear, 1.4 percentage points. Recreation, sport, and culture, 0.7 percentage points. Alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and narcotics, 0.6 percentage points. In terms of items, the top 5 contributors to inflation in terms of items are rent payments, which contributed 2.3 percentage points to the 13.7% inflation. Electricity, 1.2 percentage points. Refuse disposal, 0.7 percentage points. Charcoal, 0.65 percentage points. And yam, 0.4 percentage points. Altogether, these 5 items contributed 37 percentage points to inflation. And then in terms of regions, the 5 regions that contributed the most to inflation are Greater Accra, which contributed 3.5 percentage points, Ashanti 3.3 percentage points, followed by Eastern 1.3 percentage points, Western 1.2 percentage points, and Central 1 percentage point to the 13.7% inflation in June 2025. Now, what are the recommendations we would like to give for the June 2025 inflation outcome? For households, with food inflation still contributing 7 percentage points to the 13.7%, we think that households should lean into bulk purchases. They should also try and source local produce where possible and favor in-season staples like cereals, proteins, which are experiencing sharper price drops. Again, with electricity, refuse disposal, and rent being among the biggest drivers of inflation, households should explore energy-saving practices. And for businesses, we've seen inflation on locally produced goods declining faster than imported ones. So businesses can actually reduce their exposures to the global supply shocks that we are likely or we are experiencing already by increasing local sourcing, especially for food, packaging, and also logistics inputs. Again, businesses could practice strategic pricing, not sharp increases in prices, given that disinflation, and even in some months we've seen, on monthly basis, we've seen some products actually reducing in their prices. And as we know, consumers are becoming more sensitive to price movement. And then for government, since food remains a dominant inflation, even though we've seen a drastic drop in food inflation, government should continue to invest in transport infrastructure, irrigation, food storage, and market linkages, particularly in the north, where food inflation is high. Again, we are calling on government to tailor social protection and economic policy by region, as blanket policies will not be effective given the wide regional disparities we've observed in inflation. So there will be the need to expand targeted LEAP program or LEAP support, the NHI's outreach school feeding program, and undertake price monitoring in high inflation areas to ensure equity in responses. It would also be very useful if government should lock in the inflation gains we are making and stay the course on fiscal consolidation, implementation of strategic growth initiatives, and also appropriate monetary policy. In terms of publications, right after this release, on our website, you'll find this PowerPoint presentation on June 2025 inflation on our website. We would also accompany it with June 2025 CPI bulletin. And then we'll provide the Quick-Up annexes as well as infographics for CPI and inflation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Government Statistician, for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, the June CPI and inflation figures have been released. We stand by for any question or clarity that you want. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. And you ask your question then.
Okay. Okay.
Any question?
Yes, so for me.
Yes. Please mention your name and then the media house.
So, the name is Justice Aduboy. I write for the Shinhua News Agency. So, as we speak, looking at the Justice Aduboy, I mentioned Shinhua News Agency. Yeah, right. So, two questions for me. We see lower inflation for local products.
Yeah.
Would we say that, and then compared to the imported items,
Yeah.
would we say that it is just mimicking, the exchange rate? Because at a point you saw the exchange rate declining at a faster rate, then it holds at a place and then begins to tick up again gradually. So would you say that these inflation numbers we are seeing for locally produced items and imported items are mimicking, that exchange rate behavior? Then also, I wonder, because but that one is personal, because I was going to buy rice yesterday and I realized that no, we are not seeing that much of a drop in the prices of not only rice, many food items on the market, as we thought they would do in response to the exchange rate behavior that we are seeing lately. Thank you.
Okay.
Justice, on the rice rate, did you go to Kuala or Melcom? Because I got scammed down. The rice has come down. Anyway,
you have to change your market.
Change the market.
You have to change your market. Yes.
It is not in the 137 market. So, right. Doc, yes. Thank you again. Yeah. Sometimes you make us struggle to get questions for you. Okay. Given you cover everything. And I'm happy you have government's ears. So on the recommendation for government, I know government has heard. I noticed that the northern belt that is perceived to be a potential or the food baskets perpetually have the highest inflation. And Upper West specifically has been so, dare I say, for the past decade and more. So if we were to extrapolate the inflationary figures even over 5 years, I wonder the thousands will be hitting. Yeah. And so it triggers a bother in my mind that be that it's a border town and life is so, you're using a phrase, the cost constraints are so, biting. That may be a security threat for the nation, and also, answers the question about the rural to urban migration. So, given that you have recommendations, can you take it up to try and find out how you can find a lasting solution to that problem? Okay. At least to reduce that rate that is always high all the time. So that is one. Two, do you have weights for the regions? For example, we know that the likes of maybe Accra, maybe a commercial capital, Kumasi could be, I don't know, Volta region could be a tourism capital, or do you have weights for the region as you have for the items that you do? Yeah. Now this question is premised on the fact that when you put together the regional contribution, I was expecting Upper West to feature, given that it contributed about over 32+%, but it was not in the regional contribution. No, not on this page. There's another one. The one in the conclusion bits. But when I looked in the 5, it wasn't there.
I'll explain that.
So explain that for me. Thank you very much.
Any other question? Take the last question then. The government has response. Yes, I think.
Yeah. Okay, let me just get a clarification. He made a statement. The government has made a statement. Yeah. I wanted to be sure. You said we are seeing a clear signal of price stability. Yeah. And did you say short-term price easing?
Yes.
Short-term. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, okay. I can just. Okay. Thank you very much. So the first question is on the local inflation for local products. As I mentioned earlier, we saw inflation for locally produced items reduced by 5.2 percentage points. And then that for imported items reduced by 3.9 percentage points. The question you're asking is whether this significant drop we are seeing in locally produced items can be attributed to the exchange rate effect. That's the question you're asking.
Yeah, I'm trying to see whether the exchange rate
has any bearing
on the behavior of both imported
and the answer is yes. Except that it has the bearing is more on the imported items, because imported items means that you have to get them at using a foreign currency, and so the exchange rate plays a much more direct role. Now, for the locally produced items, if inputs that are used in the locally produced items are coming from outside or are purchased with foreign currency, then to that extent, then they would influence the locally produced items. So I think it's a straightforward answer. And then the second question is rice. Yes, I think your issue about rice. So you were saying you went to a certain market and you didn't see that significant drop in rice.
Yeah, because you see 5 kilos selling around 170 cedis.
Okay. All right. So let me answer it this way. Yeah. So like I said, we have about 57 markets where we collect these prices. And the prices we report is an average price. We develop an index, so it's not just one market. Exactly, it's an average. So you may go to a certain shop or a certain market, and a particular shop, you may not experience that, but in totality, generally, we see prices of these items and food items coming down, like we've seen here. So that, again, is a very straightforward answer to that. And then, of course, is asking about the Northern Belt. What lasting solution can contribute to addressing the high inflation in the northern regions? I think in the recommendations, we provided some recommendation to that effect. So what should happen is that to ensure that both food inflation and non-food inflation reduce in the region, we have to invest in infrastructure that bode well for price reduction. So we talked about the road networks, and then there are utilities as well. So we have to be more specific, look at the items in there that are causing the issues, and design policies to address them. Fortunately, we had outlined some of the key determinants. For example, if you took housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels, in the region, its inflation was about 125%, very, very high. Again, if you took education services, the inflation was 42.7%, again, very high. So since we have the items which are contributing the most to this inflation, we need to ensure that we implement targeted policies to bring the inflation of those items down. And then I think I could also ask a question with regards to weights for the region, Upper West region. Okay, so the point here is that what we showed here, and I'm trying to answer your question. I think you were referring to
this one. Exactly.
Is that this one?
Precise.
And you wanted to see Upper West. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so even though Upper West continued to register the highest inflation, because it has a very small weight, because the contribution is the combination of both the weight and the inflation. Correct. So if your weight is very small, then your contribution to the overall inflation may not be that impactful. That's why you don't see Upper West make it to the top 5 contributors to inflation. And then your next question you asked was whether we have weights for them. And the answer is yes, we have weights. So you see here that if you look at Upper West, that's 10. It has a weight of 1.3, right? Meanwhile, Accra has 28.5. So yes, Upper West continued to register the highest inflation of 32.3% in June this year. But because it has a very small weight of 1.3, if you put the two together, the contribution to overall inflation is not as impactful as the contribution of Greater Accra to inflation. So I think this answers the questions that came on the floor. Let's take another round, please.
Any other question? Chief, I think they are okay. Yeah. So, all right. So we thank you again for coming. We'll see you hopefully next month for the July inflation. Right. And the PPI will be released next week, Wednesday, onto our website. Yes, next week, Wednesday. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.